Hi everyone, I'm Grace Berry. I'm the Genomics Project Manager at Cheshire and Merseyside Cancer Alliance, and I'm going to talk you through a presentation today on one of the projects that's ongoing within the Alliance. We're going to talk through our approach, some of the findings, and the next steps as well. So IMPACTT stands for Improving Molecular Pathways and Cancer Turnaround Times. So just as a bit of a project overview, the IMPACTT project is working across the Northwest in partnership with the Northwest Genomic Medicine Service Alliance, the Genomic Lab Hub, and the 3 cancer alliances across the region. And we've mapped and audited a number of cancer pathways in order to support improvement work, to mitigate any variance we might find across the patch, and ultimately look to reduce turnaround times within the genomics pathways for patients. So I'm sure you're all aware of the complex geography across Cheshire and Merseyside with the flow of patients, samples and results. So we've had loads of work to do to be able to better understand the processes across the patch. And in doing that, we've already found some of the common issues affecting parts of the pathway. And as I say, ultimately we want to work to support improvements where we can, both for those working within the pathways and for patients and their sample turnaround times to results. So each cancer alliance chose their own priority tumour groups based on the understood need or complexity of each pathway from discussions with stakeholders. In Cheshire and Merseyside, we focused on gynae, and that was ovarian and endometrial tumour groups only. Colorectal cancers, which was also chosen by the other cancer alliances. So we chose that as really the exemplar pathway so that we could share learning across the region. We also included breast cancers, and then we also went on to collect data from teenage young adult patients as well, but that will be used in future work, hopefully. And then we split the approach into 3 stages, and I'll go through each of these in turn. There's pathway mapping, auditing work, and then really collating a list of issues and actions throughout each encounter with system stakeholders. So starting with the pathway mapping for colorectal, I've split this over 2 pages so that you're able to see it a little bit more clearly, so bear with. And although I've produced individual pathway maps for each pathology lab, which is specific to their individual processes or systems, this is an example of a generic map for colorectal, so just so I can talk through the stages. So starting from the top, the biopsy sample is taken in theatre, and we know that biopsy is the preferred material for genomic testing over resection samples. So they're then put into formalin fixative, and the histology request form is completed with clinical details ahead of sending over to the path lab. And then depending on which trust you're at, that's either via porters internally or through hospital transport systems. And we've had feedback actually from pathologists at this stage across the board that there is need for improvement in the completeness of the request form with full clinical details, really to help direct histopathology colleagues a little bit better. Now, some sites are moving towards electronic requesting, which would be a positive step. It would help with tracking of samples or cases across the pathway, but it's not the current picture across the region. So once in pathology, the cases are cross-referenced with the clinical details that are provided. They're booked in for tracking purposes, and some sites then use a colour coding triage system, which helps with quick visualisation of whether samples are urgent, non-urgent, or any specific sample types. So we've been able to share that good practice across the labs as we've gone as well. Following dissection and processing, the pathologist will interpret the H&E slide to confirm diagnosis and then complete a pathology report, which is then usually uploaded into an online system. In this case, that's Telepath for clinicians to gain access via ICE. The problem with that is, as is also the case actually when any genomic test result is available, is that the clinical teams are not notified of the report's availability. So it actually requires somebody within the clinical team to log on every day to check if there are any results available for each patient. Now, obviously, that's not an efficient use of anybody's time, but until there's a national solution which links systems together seamlessly, there is definitely a need for a local solution to this problem, because it's not just the colorectal pathway, it's all pathways that this is hampering. So then if colorectal carcinoma is diagnosed, the MMR-IHC, which is immunohistochemistry testing, is now reflexively requested by pathologists to test for Lynch syndrome. And as you'll all probably be aware, there's been a national programme running since 2021 to support the implementation of optimal lynch testing pathways. And those tests are usually requested via an internal online lab system. So if I just go to the next slide, the lighter blue boxes here just describe the steps taken depending on the MMR IHC results. But this has been covered a lot over the last few years through the Lynch programme, so I don't want to spend on this, to be honest. But the outcomes are either that no further testing is required because Lynch syndrome is not suspected, or that the results indicate Lynch, so the patient would then be discussed at MDT and either referred to clinical genetics or be seen through the internal mainstreaming services, which should be the case in most trusts from this year. Or then lastly, that the result requires further confirmation via hypermethylation testing at the Northwest GLH. And if that's the case, the GLH request form is completed by the pathologist, sent to a shared molecular pathology email account or pigeonholes for the admin team, who then collect the blocks, give them to the lab to prepare the slides, who then send them off to the GLH via first class post or recorded delivery. And there are two ways then for the clinicians to get the genomic test results. They are either sent via email from the GLH to the oncologist directly, where that person is known, but also they're sent to the histopathology laboratory for them to incorporate into the pathology report, authorise them for upload to ICE, where the clinicians can again log on to access the results. But where the oncologist is not listed, the results will then sit solely with pathology. So it's really good practice to incorporate and authorise those results as soon as possible within pathology so the clinical teams can have access to, in case they aren't emailed directly from the GLH. And I'll circle back to this later on when I'm touching upon the kind of improvement potential across the region. So that's the reflex pathway for newly diagnosed primary colorectal carcinomas. Going to the orange box on the left-hand side, if the patient presents with metastatic disease, then the MDT will then decide which molecular test to be requested. And that's usually KRAS, MRAS or BRAF. NTRK fusions are occasionally requested, I think, if the patient has progressed, but that was more rare. So whichever molecular test is requested, the GLH forms are again completed by the pathologist, usually noting the clinical oncologist who should receive the results. And similarly to the MLH1 hypermethylation we discussed earlier, the request is emailed to the generic molecular path email account for the admin team, who then collect the blocks, pass them to the lab for sample prep, and the process just repeats itself as before. So that, in a nutshell, is the basic genomic pathway for colorectal cancers. And these are just a few examples of the issues or barriers that were reported across the pathways and trusts. They're split into audiences, so pathology, clinical teams, and system-wide. Obviously, this isn't an exhaustive list. I just wanted to pick out a few examples to highlight. So it was reported that molecular requests were often emailed to one individual person rather than the shared molecular pathology account. Now, obviously, that creates a single point of failure if that individual is on leave. So that's something to be aware of to ensure that you know the process within your trust and are requesting in the appropriate way. Some molecular tests came through as emails to pathology requesting genomics on X, Y, or Z patient. Clearly, there's need to have more specificity in those cases. So perhaps a degree of education on which tests would be done in which circumstances, or perhaps just the standardisation of requesting would be beneficial within trusts internally. And all of this will form part of the discussions as we continue our evaluation phase of this project. So the second one down, there is no clear, efficient pathway for the communication of results to oncologists. There are inconsistencies of how the results are presented, whether that's at MDT or if the results are chased when the patient's due into clinic. And we've talked through some of those issues earlier, but just to make you aware, there is a national plan to improve the IT interoperability around results. That'll be years off now. So, in the meantime, the Northwest GLH are trialling a portal in a couple of sites, through which tests will be requested and results will be able to be accessed. It'll be a lot easier to track cases through the whole pathway then as well. So we'll keep updated on that. And then thirdly, there was one site, just as one example, there was a site who had an embargo on first-class postage across the trust, and so second-class post was routinely used to send slides to the GLH. Now, obviously, that delays the time to results. So we've worked with that trust, who now send their molecular samples first class. I just wanted to pull this out as a small example of a change in the pathway that can save some time overall. It's these incremental, smaller improvements that we're looking at, as well as the bigger picture improvements as well. And as mentioned earlier, there is a need for improvement in the amount of clinical details provided to pathology. And again, this will form part of the discussions as we continue the evaluation of this project. There are some trusts looking into electronic requesting, I think I mentioned earlier, which may improve things, especially with those kind of mismatching details on forms. But there may be some IG issues to overcome first, especially in those off-site trusts. So this is the audit data. In total, we received data relating to 406 samples across 4 pathways, and you can see the split there. So Warrington and Halton were unable to provide audit data last year due to the significant capacity issues that they'd faced, but they've now had a shift in teams, and it's fantastic that they're now able to pull that data together for us. That should be with me by the end of this month, by the end of April, which will really then add to the regional picture and ensure we've got equity across Cheshire and Merseyside with the potential for these improvements that can be made. So that's brilliant. And this is the turnaround time data for cellular pathology on the left-hand side and genomic testing on the right. It's split by tumour group, and really just to show the significant variation seen across the region. And I'm just sharing regional data today rather than the trust-specific details that have been included in the evaluation reports for each path lab. So the cellular pathology turnaround time is the time from when the samples arrived in the path lab to the time the diagnostic report was completed. And you can see that the distribution of cell path turnaround times on the left was similar across breast, colorectal and gynae samples, with the vast majority of samples having turnaround times of less than 20 days. The genomic testing turnaround time is the time from the genomic test being requested to the time that the result was then made available to the clinical teams. And that's the chart on the right. So turnaround times varied across tumour groups, with gynae, as you can see, having the widest distribution. 60% of colorectal cancer cases were turned around in between 20 to 30 days, with only 12% of cases taking less than 20 days. So there's clear room for improvement across the board. The National Genomic Test Directory specifies which genomic tests are commissioned by NHS in England, the technology by which they're available, and the patients who will be eligible to access the test. So this is just a little snippet of the Cancer Test Directory for colorectal cancers, and I thought I'd just go through a few of these and if and when they tend to be used. So regionally, the pathology network agreed that the initial test for Lynch syndrome would be best done via local immunohistochemistry testing, more so for the efficiency of results than anything else, rather than the microsatellite instability, the MSI testing that you can see is available on the National Test Directory. A further test for cases suggestive of Lynch syndrome is the MLH1 promoter hypermethylation, so test 1.5 and 1.5 here, and that's sent to the GLH for testing in those circumstances. NTREC testing was reportedly more rarely requested, as I mentioned earlier, and that tended to be in the palliative setting. And then you've got DPYD hotspot testing, and that's requested reflexively if the patient's due to start a fluoropyrimidine type chemotherapy to prevent life-threatening toxicities. And then finally, the multi-target NGS panel for KRAS, NRAS or BRAF is used in the metastatic setting. So there is some potential for improvement in the patient pathway here and turnaround times to results. If a patient is known to have metastatic disease and is a candidate for chemotherapy, the request for KRAS, NRAS or BRAF could potentially be made on the initial histopathology request form, or reflexed from histopathology where the information is communicated between the clinical team and pathology teams, rather than waiting until further down the line when the MDT discussions take place. But the IMPACT project will continue to have these types of conversations with pathology and clinical teams to assess any potential barriers to this and share in time any recommended changes in practice. We're very much still in the evaluation phase. So this chart just shows the time taken from when the genomic test results were received by the pathology lab to when they were integrated into the pathology report to ultimately be made available to clinicians to access. In most cases, that was via ICE. And you can see there's a wide distribution, but we've already talked about how the results are distributed from the GLH and the issues that clinicians can face in accessing those, as well as the potential for some of those issues to be overcome with the GLH portal and future plans for system interoperability improvement. So I'm not gonna dwell on this one. I'll move on. As part of the evaluation phase of this project, I've written a report for each pathology lab, which details each tumour group process map, as well as all of the audit data, both for the region as well as trust-specific data. And I've also pulled together some recommendations based on those results. And the aim is that, to ensure that these reports don't just sit on people's desks, but really act as catalyst conversation to support improvements across the pathway, linking together the clinical and the pathology teams. So I've just pulled out a few examples here. I won't talk to them all, but I'm happy to share these slides. So if each case reported the best block to use for genomic testing with neoplastic cell content as standard during that initial diagnostic workup phase, then the genomic sample preparation time would be reduced with less steps to have to find the blocks or the slides again for the pathologist to reassess them for tumour content just for that genomic test. And similarly, it would positively impact on the potential change in roles required for some of those steps to free up consultant time. Standardisation of both genomic test requesting as well as report writing with the consistency of terminology really across sites will be beneficial for clinical teams because they're the ones who have to interpret the reports, especially with the advent of digital pathology where there could be cross-site reporting too. As I've already mentioned, considering reflex testing within the metastatic setting could contribute to improved turnaround times to results, but we would need to ensure that other parts of the pathway don't come under too much strain. So far, the focus of this project has really been on the pathology pathways, but these are a few of the clinical team recommendations that came from conversations with teams during the process mapping phase of the work. Again, these aren't exhaustive. There's loads more work to do with clinical teams to understand more of the barriers and the potential improvements that can be made, but just to list a few, making sure that there is sufficient clinical information provided on pathology request forms was up there. Standardising those request forms and ensuring that they're used rather than emails just asking for genomics on XYZ sample, because that just further slows down the request, to be honest, because clarity is then needs to be sought. Ensuring that the medical oncologist is named on any genomic test request so that the results can be sent from the GLH directly to that oncologist. And really just improving the links between clinical and histopathology teams, making the communication as efficient as possible as genomic test requests only increase will just benefit the patient pathway and reduce turnaround times ultimately. And then finally, some of the system-wide recommendations that we're aware of. The need for genomic education across the board is evident. The Northwest GMSA completed a project last year called the Training Needs Analysis Project, TNA, which through questionnaire and interview collated across from colleagues across the Northwest work to really identify gaps in education and training for all workforce groups concerning genomics and the application for genomic testing within these cancer pathways. So this is the first webinar that we've pulled together, which we hope will provide really useful information. We're keen to hear your feedback following the webinar so we can make sure these are really valuable resources that are actually of benefit to you all. IT interoperability improvements we've already discussed, and tumour-specific clinical quality groups or pathology boards should work really to establish optimal testing pathways, which will be informed, no doubt, by the NHS England Genomics Unit in the coming months. And that's all from me.